Hi, everyone. Hang tight for just a few seconds while we let our audience settle in. We'll get started here shortly. Appreciate your patience. Excellent. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the 40th Annual Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. We're so happy to have you with us today. My name is Reza Sadegzadeh. I'm a third-year law student at University of Oregon, and I, along with Michelle Matson, will be moderating this panel for you. Before we get started, just gotta go over some quick housekeeping matters. First and foremost, we want to acknowledge that our university is located on Kalapula Eligi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapia people. We just want to be mindful of that as we proceed. And just a quick reminder, you shouldn't worry if you can't see yourself. This is a Zoom webinar and all of our attendees are automatically muted with their video turned off. That way you could dedicate all your undivided attention to our panelists, but please feel free to submit any questions you have using the Q&A function. We will try to address those at the end of our panel. And as you may already know, for the past 40 years, this conference has been organized by a University of Oregon law students. And this year's law conference would have not certainly been possible if it wasn't for all their hard work. Just want to give a quick shout out to all our current conference co-directors and our first year law students who made this conference happen this year. And just a special thanks to Molly Hooks, who actually organized this panel for us today. And if you'd like to support our students, you can always donate to Friends of Land, Air, and Water, FLAW for short. FLAW is a nonprofit organization made up of our alumni. All of the contribution donated to FLAW turns into stipend for first and second year law students who will be doing unpaid internship work for public interest environmental organization this summer. And one last thing, this panel is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube shortly thereafter. You could also access all of the other panels that we had organized this year and the ones we had put together last year. Our YouTube channel is a great educational resource for our audience, and it's easily accessible. If you search PILC on YouTube, just please to make sure to like and subscribe. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists for today as we discuss issues on how to protect our local forest. And we have the pleasure to have Chandra LeGue from Oregon Wild, David Mildrexler from Eastern Oregon Legacy Land, and Francis Eatherington. Thank you all so much for taking the time out of your weekend to be with us today, and I would like to pass the mic. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. And yeah, I think we're all happy to be here. It's nice to be able to carry on the conference in this format. So yeah, my name is Chandra LeGue. I work with Oregon Wild, a statewide environmental advocacy organization working to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters for nearly 50 years. When I proposed this panel, the forest conservation community was really excited to see the newly released article in the journal Nature by Dr. Beverly Law and several collaborators that laid out a framework for identifying high priority forests across the West as strategic carbon reserves. So we're really grateful to have one of the co-authors on that article, David Mildrexler, with us today to talk about this framework and the forests he calls home in northeastern Oregon. One of the things that framework highlights is that there are many forests in Oregon that should be preserved to better address the climate and biodiversity crises we're currently facing. Unfortunately, many of these forests do not have adequate protections to meet this challenge. So on our panel today, we also have Francis Eatherington, who has devoted a huge part of her life to defending forests in the Umpqua watershed and other public lands in southwestern Oregon. She will talk about some of the ongoing threats to public forest lands in this region that could, if managed differently, play a role in protecting numerous ecological and community values. Scientists worldwide agree that in order to stave off a biodiversity crisis and reverse global climate change, bold action towards conservation is needed. They recommend working to conserve 30% of the planet's natural lands and oceans by the year 2030, right around the corner. Governments and NGOs have begun to work together to achieve this goal across the globe, known as 30 by 30. And this idea is one of the underlying concepts for the Strategic Carbon Reserve Framework that David will talk about. So after David and Francis, I'm going to talk about how public land and forest protection campaigns in Oregon can contribute to this goal. So without further ado, I will turn it over to David for the next little bit.
Okay, is my screen visible to you all? I'm going to get started here. Thank you, Chandra. I'm going to talk about strategic forest reserves that can protect biodiversity in the Western United States and mitigate climate change. That's the title of our paper, and I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Bill Ripple, Dr. Polly Biotti, Dr. Logan Berner, and lead author, Dr. Beverly Law. My name is David Mildrexler. I work as systems ecologist for Eastern Oregon Legacy Lands, and this is the Thinking Big and Thinking Local for Forest Protections panel. I want to thank the organizers and ELA for putting on this conference. I'd like to start by doing just that, by thinking big. It is critical now that we understand the Earth as a holistic system, because our impacts today are feeding up to challenge the whole planetary system. It's absolutely critical that we urgently reduce greenhouse gas emissions so that we can get off this trajectory that is leading towards ruining the entire climate system at the expense of most of life on Earth. Part of solving that problem is also understanding the natural climate solutions that Earth offers. And to do that, we must think about the planet in a systems framework and address the problem at the systems level. Today, I'm talking about the forest system that covers about 30% of the global land area. We've learned a lot about this system. We know that forest biomes, including tropical, temperate, and boreal forests, play a crucial role in mitigating climate change by serving as carbon sinks that store about 40% of the total organic carbon on land in their biomass and soils, and that the largest 1% of trees store about half of all above ground carbon in forests worldwide. We know that forests provide critical habitats to more than half of all known plant and animal species on Earth, and that approximately 75% of the world's accessible fresh water comes from forests, with a large number of the world's cities relying on forested watersheds for their water supply. Forests are essential for human well-being, and when we preserve forests, we're able to preserve those qualities. Our study focuses on biodiversity, carbon, and water, and we look at some of the protection measures in place that I've listed here: wilderness, national parks and monuments, wild and scenic rivers, and other strict nature reserves. And I think oftentimes in the past, we've thought about these as more isolated protection measures, but it's now time that we need to look at them as part of an overall forest reserve system, where each part is contributing to a much greater whole that secures the functionality of the entire forest reserve system, so that it can continue to provide these critical Earth system qualities. Unfortunately, most of the world's forests are not managed for conservation values. I thought I'd just show you a contrasting scene from Oregon. I like this map because it's overlaid an intact forest landscape that's now become protected, called the Devil's Staircase Wilderness. At this time, it was a proposal. It's overlaid on a map of tons of carbon, the white being private industrial forests with very low carbon, the green being the intact forest landscape that hadn't been logged. You can see how contrasting the land can be out there when it's not managed at all for anything other than production values, and also how flexible and effective protection tools like wilderness can be in protecting these landscapes. Clearly, we need to think about securing connectivity to the Siuslaw National Forest for this landscape. So we know that protected areas are cornerstones of conserving intact landscapes that provide clean water, fish and wildlife habitat, and climate change mitigation, while also supporting sustainable economies worth billions of dollars annually. Recent analysis drawing from a range of lines of evidence suggests that maintaining the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystem services at a global scale depends on effective and equitable conservation of approximately 30 to 50% of Earth's land, freshwater, and ocean areas, including currently near natural ecosystems. That's a quote from the new climate change report from the IPCC just out. And some of these incredible scientists who have spent their lives studying species area relationships have provided the foundation for that research. So that is where these initiatives have come from, to protect and restore at least 50% of the Earth's land area as intact natural ecosystems. Pledges have been made, and we want to protect 30% of the land and waters by 2030 and protect 50% by 2050. Here in our study, we focus on the land and the forests, of course. Only 6.1% of forest land in the conterminous United States is protected at the highest level. And so it leads to the question, how do we achieve our preservation targets given the pressing need to increase carbon removals from the atmosphere, make substantial reductions in carbon emissions, protect biodiversity, and slow the accelerating species losses? That's a lot on our plate at once. It's important to recognize that climate and biodiversity are inextricably connected with each other and with human futures. That was the main message of the landmark IPBES IPCC joint report on biodiversity and climate change. Limiting global warming to ensure a habitable climate and protecting biodiversity are mutually supporting goals, and their achievement is essential for sustainably and equitably providing benefits to people. I think if you've had the opportunity or fortunate enough to grow up or spend time in Oregon, you've probably experienced this like I have in our water and species and carbon-rich forests, recognizing how all of these values are mutually combined in the landscape. Here's a picture from the Huckleberry Roadless area on the edge of the Eagle Cap Wilderness. Certainly not all of Eastern Oregon's forests are dry forests. Our study focuses on the Western United States temperate forests. The nexus of carbon and biodiversity hasn't been carefully evaluated here. We asked these questions: how much forest land is currently protected in each Western state, and how much additional forest land would need to be protected to reach the 30% and 50% targets? Which forest lands are the highest priority for preservation to meet these targets, if prioritized based on forest carbon and biodiversity? Who owns the forest lands that have the highest preservation priority? And last, if these targets were reached, and how much forest carbon and species habitat would occur in protected areas compared with the present? The data analysis and framework relies on spatial metrics of biodiversity, including species and habitat data, carbon stocks and accumulation under climate change and future vulnerability to drought or wildfire to produce preservation priority rankings. So starting with what's currently protected, on the left is a map showing areas that are currently protected as either USGS GAP status 1 or 2. Those statuses continue on to 3 and 4 and so on and get subsequently weaker. So think of GAP status 1 and 2 as relatively strong protections, with 1 being the strongest. Those are the protections we're most interested in. About 14% of regional forest area is currently protected as GAP 1. So to achieve 30 by 30, an additional 16% of forest area needs protected. If the analysis includes both GAP 1 and GAP 2, 18.9% of forest area is currently protected, and an additional 11.1% of forest area would need to be protected by 2030. So this provides an overview and shows that while we've made some progress, we have quite a bit of work to do. If we look at the state protections, I've highlighted Oregon. Oregon has the largest amount of total forest at 12.68 million hectares, and the second highest proportion of its state coverage in forest at 50%. Notably, though, it has the lowest proportion of any state protected at 10%. Forest preservation priority ranks shown here on the right were derived from forest carbon and forest biodiversity priority ranks shown below, and then including and excluding forest land with high future vulnerability and summarized by ecoregion and state. The forest preservation priority maps show spatially where to focus forest protections that would be most effective in providing climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation goals. As you can see, highest PPR values are primarily in mountain ranges and well distributed in the Pacific Northwest. Note that on the panel on the far right, where you can see areas excluded due to vulnerability in bright yellow, most of those areas are in the Southwest United States, but there are still plenty of high priority areas at the high elevations. Note the Pacific Northwest forests show relatively low vulnerability to future mortality. To attain preservation targets, priority areas were identified by sequentially combining the highest ranked forest lands within each state until each protection target was met. What these maps show is a pathway to a well-distributed reserve system across the Western United States forest. It's also notable that we were able to achieve these targets in each state. Given that some areas had more vulnerability, I took this as a very positive sign that we can still achieve these goals. Turning to land ownership, we found that regional forest lands with the highest preservation priority are primarily owned by the federal government, followed by private entities, tribal governments, and state governments. Note that the federal lands include public lands, and that comprises 61 to 62%. I noted that IRAs comprise 24 to 28% of high priority federal lands. That's important because IRAs are a known quantity. They're ready to be protected. They're wilderness quality lands. Private ownership is substantial. And notice in some areas, tribal ownership can be as high as 45% of high preservation priority areas. Between 30 and 50% targets, there was little difference in these trends. If we look at on the left at the impacts on carbon stocks from achieving these targets, we see that currently only 20% of carbon stocks are protected. By protecting 30% of the forest area, we'd bump that up to 34%. And by protecting 50% of the forest area, we'd nearly triple carbon protected. Notice on the lower left, we also looked at carbon accumulation. That's very important. By protecting these forests, we also identified which ones would accumulate the most carbon into the future. On the right, we see that currently less than 20% of habitat is protected for amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, and trees. As we move into a 30% forest preservation framework, we were able to protect about 30% of the habitat for these species, and with a 50% forest preservation target, about half of the habitat was preserved. This commensurate increase shows what a well-distributed reserve system can do, and the importance of performing these computations at the ecoregional scale so that the facets of biodiversity are protected across the landscape. Besides safeguarding climate and biodiversity, preserving high priority forests would help clean water, protect it, provide a crucial ecosystem service, giving mounting concerns over water security in the Western United States. In Oregon alone, 80% of drinking water comes from forested landscapes, and protections would help address water scarcity and security in the face of climate change. Currently, only 19% of the most important forest lands for surface drinking water are preserved, but we could improve that to 33% and 53% respectively by achieving these targets, and those are in the areas that are most important for surface drinking water. So much more of Oregon's forests need protections. This map here, created by Dr. Berner, summarizes and shows that we could achieve these targets across the landscape And much of the forest area would not need to be protected. So it shows this is a very attainable vision. Oregon has a key role to play because it has the most total forest, but the lowest proportion protected of any state. And it also has a lot of low forest vulnerability. In other words, it's a good place to focus protections. Substantial progress could be made by protecting roadless and undeveloped lands. So let's look at that a little closer. Here's a map of the Pacific Northwest, and the Blue Mountains where I live and work is highlighted in a bold black line. But just scan this map and notice that you can easily visually see that Oregon has less protections in wilderness and bright green and one national park compared to our neighbors. It's not even close. Oregon lags far behind its neighbors, and there's absolutely no ecological or justified reason for this. And this plays out on the landscape in important ways. Look here at the Blue Mountains. What we find when we have less area protected, we have smaller reserves. They're isolated and disconnected from each other. There are no connective corridors between them, and the size is very inequitably distributed across the landscape. I've highlighted the North Fork John Day multi-unit wilderness because this is an important model for future protections in the Blue Mountains. We've been looking at all of the roadless areas across the Blue Mountains here, mapped in dark green, and you can just visually see how if we protected those landscapes, it would reduce the distance between our roadless areas and our wilderness areas dramatically. Some would become connected, and many more large core areas would be established. I'm just going to zoom in on one of the areas in the upper right-hand corner. This is the Joseph Canyon Wild Horse Roadless Area, two large areas on federal lands next to tribal land owned by the Nez Perce tribe. If we were to focus restoration around the edges of these landscapes, instead of what we're doing now, which is temporary road building and logging, we could actually make these systems whole, make them more intact, and improve their manageability as wilderness. That's the vision we have for this landscape. Also note on the image on the right, there's a lot of private land mapped in brown. We found that over 20% of private lands are important for the Forest Preservation Priority Framework. I want to highlight this area with the Minam River in the black box. And on the next slide, show you that the phase 1 purchase of this landscape has already been completed. It's a very exciting initiative between the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's transferring this private industrial forest into public hands, and it butts right up against the Eagle Cap Wilderness and the Huckleberry Inventoried Roadless Area with the Minam River, one of Oregon's great wilderness rivers flowing through. So we are making progress, and we need to see more of this. And so we've looked at some of these areas that I'm sure you're familiar with. The Eagle Cap Wilderness, Oregon's largest wilderness, shown on the left. On the upper right, the Wenatchee-Tucannon Wilderness that spans the Oregon and Washington border. You can also see the North Fork Umatilla Wilderness, a small area at the bottom left of that image. And in the southern Blue Mountains, and in the bottom right, you see the Black Canyon Wilderness and the Strawberry Mountains Wilderness. All the areas in green are basically large tracts of undeveloped landscapes that could be protected now. We've outlined restoration areas that would improve the integrity of these areas. Of course, we want to see how this lines up with the strategic forest reserves data. So when we drop that layer on top in pink and labeled with transparency so you can see through, you can see there's a lot of overlap here. Note in the Eagle Cap Wilderness, much of that area that's ready to be protected is very important from the Strategic Forest Reserves Framework. In the Lake Fork Roadless area around Eagle Creek and the Catherine Creek drainage, and up north to the Huckleberry Mountains productive forests. Real opportunities to move quick and achieve our 30 by 30 goals. In the right panel, going from right to left, the Wildcat Roadless area, the Grand Ronde Inventoried Roadless area, the Walla Walla Inventoried Roadless area. And notice the municipal drinking watershed. We're going to need to be aware of places like that. Heading down the image, you've got the Looking Glass Inventoried Roadless area and the Hellhole, all important areas identified in our analysis. And in the bottom right corner, this entire area from the Ochuco Mountains to the Strawberries is a key corridor. and our strategic forest reserves data identified it as very important to protect. There are great opportunities to move quickly in those areas. And to highlight one more area, we call this the Blues Front. There are a couple, it's an area with a lot of roads and not much large areas left. So it's very important to protect what remains. Two of them are Texas Butte and Potamus Canyon, shown here. With some focused restoration, we could bring these areas together, make them more whole and functional. With the 30 by 30 data, you can see there are some important overlap here. And I want to illustrate to you, as we move into the 50 by 50 framework, it even gets more important that we protect these areas. Note that some of these roadless areas are actually non-forested, and that's why you don't always see a high overlap, simply because our analysis was focused on forest, and many of these steep canyons are grasslands, and in fact, that's the reason why they're left as roadless areas. There are also outstanding opportunities in another amazing part of Oregon, the Southwest region, that the Strategic Forest Reserves framework is identified as important for protecting carbon and biodiversity. I'm going to hand it off now to Francis Eatherington to speak to you about that. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Francis Eatherington, and I have been looking at timber sales in Southwest Oregon for a number of years. I'm a retired conservation director for Umpqua Watersheds and for Cascadia Wildlands, and I still do a lot of volunteer work with those organizations. And today I'm going to be talking about the forest of Southwest Oregon and basically the BLM forests and how they could better become part of a climate solution. And let me see, I'm going to share my screen. And, share. And then I do this. Oh, and I go back to slide one. Okay, here I am. Can you see that? Am I showing my slides okay? Okay, great, thank you. Now, first I'm going to give you a little history of the lands in Southwest Oregon. Much of the lands here are checkerboarded ownership, with every other section or every other square mile owned by the federal government. And those are the yellow lands owned by the BLM that you see on the map here. And the white is private land. And this is because in 1866, our government gave every other square mile to the Oregon and California Railroad. That's the O&C Railroad. They received land for 20 miles on either side of the railroad corridor. And they were supposed to sell the land to settlers to finance public transportation, but they failed to do that. So the land got revested back to the United States and eventually was turned over to BLM to manage. That's the Bureau of Land Management, which we use the term BLM, Bureau of Land Management. And on the map, the BLM lands are the yellow squares, and each a square mile, and much of the interspersed white squares belong to private industrial forest land owners. And they look a lot like this on the ground. What you're looking at here is a logging truck driving through a clear cut. At profit is their number one benefit to corporate shareholders. So they re-clear cut their lands on a very short rotation, 40 years or so, maybe less. Not much carbon is stored here. In fact, an Oregon State University study found that logging is the biggest source of carbon pollution in Oregon. And BLM also found that 84% of carbon emissions from logging comes from private land, 9% from the federal forest in Western Oregon. Now, here's a picture of a BLM forest in Southwest Oregon. This is one of the yellow squares on the map. It's also a proposed timber sale, but We don't want to go there. After the ONC lands like this were reclaimed by the federal government, the ONC Act was passed in 1937. Now, this ONC Act required sustained yield forestry on the ONC lands. Sustained yield basically means they eventually have to log it. And we will be talking, you're going to be hearing more about sustained yield later on. And now, even though the BLM lands are in a checkerboard with private industrial lands, science has found them essential to the success of conservation, like providing habitat and connectivity for endangered species, and they are essential for carbon storage. The carbon pouring off private lands is hard to stop. We have more control over public lands. But by 1990, when the spotted owl was protected under the Endangered Species Act, about half of the ONC lands had already been clear cut by the BLM and converted to tree farms. So, but thanks to the spotted owl, the BLM began a new management plan, the Northwest Forest Plan, in 1994. It required wildlife reserves to remain unlogged. The timber industry objected, claiming the 1937 ONC Act's sustained yield requirement meant no BLM forest can be protected for conservation. But in 1995, we took it to court. Judge Dwyer ruled that the ONC Act gave the BLM authority to manage ONC lands for conservation purposes. So BLM began managing under the Northwest Forest Plan, which at the time, 1995, said nothing about climate or carbon. In 2016, just a couple years ago, the BLM began managing ONC lands under a new resource management plan. It resulted in more logging and more clear cuts, but the new plan does consider climate a little bit. It says trees are important for storing climate, it says trees are important for storing carbon, and there are so many trees the BLM can cut a lot and it won't make a difference to carbon storage. But clearly, old growth forests like this one that you see here are important for carbon storage. According to Dr. Dominic Della Sella from Wild Heritage, West Coast forests are some of the most carbon dense forests in the world. If protected in a national carbon reserve network of federal lands, these forests could play a key role in helping us transition to a climate safe economy. These forests already store the equivalent of 7 times the US annual emissions. Protecting them is vital to a safe climate. Here is another BLM forest. This is a coastal forest managed by Coos Bay BLM near Coquille, Oregon. It's full of the wet forest tree species like hemlock and Port Orford cedar, as well as the overstory Douglas fir, centuries-old trees, and tons of stored carbon. Now, a valuable forest like this one, this is a sail called Preacher Man. When they're cut down, of course, much of that carbon is lost. Preacher Man was just clear cut last month. The BLM did an environmental assessment for this logging, and they said impacts to climate and carbon are minimal and do not exceed what was considered in their 2016 plan. You know, they don't do a site-specific analysis for carbon impacts. They always refer to the overall 2016 plan that says this logging here and anything BLM does in Western Oregon for 50 years is not significant for carbon loss. Okay. The BLM claims that carbon storage would increase under the 2016 plan, and greenhouse gas emissions would increase also, but only by a little bit. The BLM says that the current carbon storage on Western Oregon lands will increase by 30% in 50 years. Note that the plan admits that greenhouse gas emissions would increase also. This is, they say, because of burning, logging, slash. Now, this is the Kenyon Mountain timber sale right after logging. And you can see that there's lots of logging slash around. Logging generates a lot of slash. Here's a big pile of logging slash. Slash is the stuff that stays on the ground that they don't remove or they don't sell. And there's a bunch of slash around here on the ground here. So they burn this slash. Here was the big pile of slash burn. And this is the slash all over the ground. They do broadcast burning right here. So this is where their increased emissions come from, they claim. Now, in the 2016 plan, the BLM mentions the concept of maximize carbon storage. But then they dismiss it by saying, oh no, the BLM has no legal or regulatory direction to manage BLM lands for carbon storage. And carbon storage is not part of the purpose and need for the action. Purpose and need was for logging, and that's all they will consider. The public comments asked them to maximize carbon storage, and the BLM repeated that they have no legal mandate to manage for carbon storage. They added, the BLM has various climate-related policies, but none provides an authority for the BLM to minimize carbon emissions above the mandate for a sustained yield of timber. There's that sustained yield again. I thought Judge Dwyer said they could do that, but anyway, the BLM made clear the federal government has not established any goals with respect to carbon storage and does not require that federal agencies maximize carbon storage. Thus, we continue to see proposals like this. This is the 42 Divide timber sale. This is a Roseburg BLM timber sale. This is near the town of Camas Valley. This forest you see right here on these pictures is a late successional reserve. It's otherwise known as a spotted owl reserve. It's a beautiful old growth forest, never logged before. And the BLM claims they have to log this forest because it needs more diversity. And I want to point out here, excuse me, that the BLM cannot cut down trees like this one here on the right. Any tree, they can't cut down any tree over 40 inches across that is also over 170 years old, unless they need to put a road there, then they could cut it down. But logging everything around these big trees is still a significant loss of habitat and carbon. This here is another picture of the same sale, but not in the reserve. Instead, this is known as the harvest land base. This could be the biggest loss of carbon because these forests will be clear cut. Not only is this a shameful loss of carbon, this particular proposal clear cuts immediately adjacent to at least 3 families' homes. In the picture on the right here, I took this picture standing in the proposed BLM timber sale. That is how close it comes to the Quinn family home here. Now, this is in spite of the studies that show plantations are more prone to fire than older forests. So essentially, the BLM is not only losing carbon, they are increasing the fire hazard for rural families. Now, scientists have determined that our warming climate will cause more wildland fires. And indeed, it seems like that is what is happening. In 2020, Southwest Oregon forest had historic acres burned. And the BLM, to their credit, does not claim, as industry does, that forest fire causes carbon loss. Instead, the BLM estimates that wildfire will reduce carbon storage by only about 0.3% in Western Oregon. And the BLM also finds that biochar, that's the burnt trees and vegetation caused by fire, can persist in soils for several hundred to several thousand years, providing carbon storage instead of emissions. Nonetheless, the forest fires had also caused BLM to increase their logging of burnt trees, even though they still retain most of their carbon. Now, these pictures here, this is a spotted owl reserve. The BLM would not otherwise be able to log. But these stumps are from trees that were cut down and sold to prevent them from endangering the traveling public, known as hazard trees, even though they are on a remote gravel road that dead ends just feet from here. Now, if nothing changes, the BLM will continue to cut down 250 million board feet of trees in Western Oregon every year for the next 50 years. I'm not sure how much carbon that is, but it is a lot. The BLM accepts comments from you at any time. You know, you can tell the BLM that their management plan is out of date and they need to consider that forests in Oregon are a high priority for protection to help the global efforts to protect 30% of natural areas. You know, we need the BLM to support and become part of the Strategic Carbon Reserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. All right, do you guys see my screen? All right, cool. Well, hi again, I'm Chandra LeGue. I've worked with Oregon Wild for the past 18 years, advocating for forest protection and restoration, wildlands and waters protection, and doing public outreach about our campaigns at things like this. I'm based in Eugene, but I've spent time all over Oregon exploring the forests and wildlands that we're talking about today. So yeah, thanks, Frances, for those really clear examples of how the forests in our region are under threat, despite their importance as climate, biodiversity, and community resources, and how we need our federal agencies to reprioritize carbon in their management plans. So the aim for my portion of this panel is to zoom things sort of back out to a little bit to look at how the Strategic Climate Reserve framework that David talked about and the kind of public lands logging that that Frances highlighted can be used to motivate Oregon and our whole region to better protect our climate-rich forests and public lands. So much of the work that needs to be done to protect these forests can also help the US achieve its 30 by 30 goals to protect 30% of lands and waters as natural areas to mitigate climate change and preserve biodiversity. And while this global 30 by 30 campaign goal and the United States commitment to it are relatively new, the work that groups like Oregon Wild and many others have been doing for decades have been contributing to these protection goals, making it possible, we hope, to achieve that bold vision. So for example, at Oregon Wild, we've been working to protect wilderness areas, wild roadless lands, wild and scenic rivers, national monuments, and old growth forests since before it was cool, let's say. So let's advance. So let's talk about where we primarily do that work and where we can have the most success, which is federally owned public lands. David talked about this a little bit, but if we do a crosswalk of the Strategic Carbon Reserve framework that he laid out and land ownership, we will see that public lands offer the best opportunities to get to our 30 or 50% goals. In Oregon, public lands make up about half the state, and about half of that is forested. And with the Strategic Carbon Reserve that David laid out, as he said, 67% of the high priority forests that they identified are in Oregon are on federal public lands. Just to show one of those maps that David did again, a lot of the lands identified in our region here in blue and green in Oregon are public lands. So I don't have that overlay, but it would definitely line up pretty closely. I do want to note, though, that there is plenty of potential for private, state, and tribal lands to contribute to forest protection goals. In the framework that David laid out, about a quarter of forests identified as high priority are on private land, but they're managed mostly for timber production. And so the law and policy that we have currently prioritizes timber over other things like carbon, water, wildlife values. And it's really hard to protect private lands to high standards, as Francis showed us. So those laws and policies can be changed, and there are folks working on that. It's not the topic of this panel. And then in President Biden's plan for 30 by 30 that came out, called the America the Beautiful report, I guess, that includes some voluntary incentives-based approaches to conservation, such as utilizing land trusts and conservation easements. And it also lays out how important it is to work with tribal nations to meet 30 by 30 goals. So in Oregon, there are already some pretty good protections for a lot of our public lands, as David talked about, but only 10% of Oregon lands meet those highest standards of protection as defined by the US Geological Survey as GAP 1 and 2. So a reminder of what that generally means. The USGS defines protection status as GAP levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, where only 1 and 2 really meet the level of conservation protection that meets the intent of the scientific community's call for action on 30 by 30 preservation. So GAP 1 and 2 means that areas have mandated management plans that protect biodiversity and natural processes. So as the Biden administration works to identify areas that help meet 30 by 30, we really feel strongly that protected lands need to meet those high standards. Almost all of the GAP 1 and 2 lands in Oregon are on federal public lands, namely in designated wilderness, national parks and monuments, wild and scenic river corridors, wilderness study areas out in on BLM lands on the east side, and national wildlife refuges. So on this map, that's what shows up. GAP 1 in darker green and GAP 2 in the tan color. They pretty much fall into those categories I just listed. I want to zoom in again on southwestern Oregon to get a close up to see some of those more specific areas that meet those criteria. So on this map in southwest Oregon, you can see wilderness areas like the Rogue-Umpqua Divide, Grassy Knob and Copper Salmon, Wild Rogue, the Kalmiopsis, the really big one, and then several that are connected surrounding Crater Lake National Park. There's also the Cascades Institute National Monument there, and some of the Klamath wildlife refuges. But in this corner of the state, there's some of Oregon's most special places. They're rich in biodiversity, water quality, carbon storage, and cultural resources. So not surprisingly, they do light up on the maps that David was showing us for the strategic reserve. But there's many other important lands in this corner of Oregon and across the state that are still not protected enough to meet the high standards necessary for 30 by 30. And it's vital that they have those protections. So how do we get there? That's kind of the key question. It's really great to have new studies, data, and mapping that show areas that are rich in biodiversity, carbon richness, and old forests. New ones are coming out all the time right now, in addition to the Law et al. Study that David worked on. So those are, that's key information that will hopefully be incorporated into a 30 by 30 atlas that the USDA is currently taking comment on. You might have seen some alerts in your inbox if you subscribe to any number of organizations' alerts. So we can use all that data to inform places to protect. And then we can also use additional overlays and capitalize on efforts by various activists and organizations to take major steps forward. Oregon Wild put together a list of opportunities that we see in our state, and I know there are many other groups out there thinking about how to contribute to this urgent need for protecting our natural world. You can find that if you, I think, search 30 by 30 on Oregon Wild's website. So for example, at the state level, the governor and state agencies could permanently protect all of the mature and old growth stands in Oregon state forests, such as the Elliott. Francis was on a panel about the Elliott yesterday, and there's some progress being made in doing that. There's other opportunities to use authorities like state scenic waterways and outstanding resource waters to better protect waterways and the forests that keep our water clean on state lands. On federal public lands, there's a wide variety of avenues for protection. Nationwide, there are ongoing efforts to pass legislation such as the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act that would better provide for habitat connectivity. And there's an effort to codify the protections of the Roadless Rule, the Roadless Area Conservation Act, that could help IRAs contribute to or gain GAP 1 status. And there's also efforts across the country to designate additional wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, and national monuments that can all feed into this effort. So here in Oregon, one major thing that Congress can do is to designate new or expand wilderness areas. And there are several campaigns already in the works. So I mentioned the Wild Road Wilderness, and you can also see the Wild and Scenic River Corridor laid out on this map. But there's an effort to expand the Wild Road Wilderness to include the Zane Gray Roadless area and other places under the Oregon Recreation Enhancement Act that has been already moved through the Senate. There is some Oregon Sierra Club chapters that are championing expansions of the Waldo Lake Wilderness. And the Oregon Natural Desert Association, ONDA, is working to expand some of Oregon's desert wilderness areas, such as the Greater Hart-Sheldon area and Oahe Canyonlands. There's also an effort to create a Crater Lake Wilderness, which has been underway by local activists for years. This would include connections from Diamond Peak through the Southern Cascades into the North Umpqua and Upper Rogue River areas, using Crater Lake, our only national park, as its center. And that would encompass the headwaters of 5 major rivers and a lot of key wildlife migration corridors. So it would check a lot of boxes as far as contributing to the needs to protect 30% of our lands and waters. Other legislation that could help meet 30 by 30 goals include the River Democracy Act, which would designate over 4,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers across Oregon with protected forest buffers. Developed and introduced by Senator Wyden last year, this bill could see movement this year and has a huge list of supporting businesses, elected officials, scientists, and organizations. There's also an opportunity for the Biden administration to designate new or expand national monuments here in Oregon. So for example, we first need to hang on to the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument that we have, but there's opportunities to expand that. And there's also an effort to designate a Douglas Fir National Monument in the Central Cascades that would prioritize the protection and restoration of 750 square miles of forests. David talked about the importance of protecting roadless areas quite a bit, but I just want to highlight across the state some of those roadless areas. There are about 2 million acres of inventoried roadless areas in Oregon, but since their protections aren't legislated, they don't really meet the high GAP standards that we would prefer to see. So protections for those areas could be enhanced through management plan updates. And we could also add additional roadless areas that aren't part of the current inventory, which would add another 2 million acres of forested roadless areas in Oregon. So there's kind of 2 different layers there. On this map, you can see Forest Service roadless areas in sort of the darkest color of green, and then where it says citizens roadless inventory, those are additional unroaded areas not part of the roadless rule. You can also see those unprotected roadless forests show up on this map. These are forest areas over 1,000 acres in size that have never been logged. And you can see forests that meet GAP 1 and 2 status in green here. So there's a lot of unprotected roadless forests in Oregon that should be protected. Unfortunately, a lot of them are still at risk. So to bring it back to some of the places that Francis talked about and David zoomed in on also in Northeast Oregon, those aren't the only forests that are facing threats. Thousands of acres of carbon and biodiversity rich forests on public lands across the region are targeted for logging every year. So from the Flat Country Project in the Willamette National Forest to the Big Mosquito Project on the Malheur National Forest, logging plans targeting these old forests, the ones that are most important for biodiversity and carbon storage, are ongoing. A year ago, we helped draw attention to some of those old forests threatened by logging in this story map. There's a link up there on the screen, focusing on the Pacific Northwest and Southeast Alaska. Since then, some of those projects have moved forward, but others, like in the Tongass, where roadless area protections are being considered again, are stopped for now. And we can keep fighting individual timber sales, and we will. But with the expansion of categorical exclusions, Trump-era reductions in large tree protections in Eastern Oregon, and timber quotas still dominating forest management decisions on our public lands, our attorneys and activists are up against a lot. So one way to head off logging threats to these old forests and help meet preservation goals is for the Biden administration to issue a rule that would protect all remaining mature and old growth forests and trees on federal lands across the country. So launched last month, the Climate Forest Campaign is a huge movement calling for an end to old forest logging as a cornerstone of US climate policy and tying all of this together. The campaign just got started, but it has an ambitious goal of 50,000 signers by Earth Day so that the Biden administration feels pressure to take bold steps that are needed to protect this vital carbon resource. And you can sign the petition at the website www.climate-forest.org. So to wrap up, clearly, Oregon's spectacular wildlands, forests, and waters can play a major role in accomplishing the 30 by 30 goal to address the biodiversity and climate crises that we're facing. We have the tools to get there. We just have to keep up the work. So thank you all so much. I know we didn't leave a ton of room or time for questions, but there might.
No worries. We do have a little bit of buffer timing between this panel and the next panel. I just want to thank you all first and foremost for your time. You know, I love it when panelists actually give audience something, you know, they could do, you know, about reaching out and actually having an impact. You know, I know personally, I know there's not a question, haven't posted it. I just want to, I had one thing in my mind as you all were talking, you know, and that was the policy work that needs to be done on state level, and you know, namely the Forest Practice Act. I know Doug Cork, who's a Clean Water Act attorney who's on, actually one of our attendees right now. He actually, I learned from him recently that because of that act, Oregon is actually missing out on a lot of federal fundings because of the coastal zoning issues. And then I also just learned from some of your friends, Francis, over at Omka Watershed, that a lot of the Western Oregon schools are being funded by logging. And I feel like there's, you know, to put it politely, I think that there's some antiquated policies going on in Oregon. And I was just wondering if you all had any thoughts on that. We have a large amount of audience, thankfully, for this panel. And I thought it would be, you know, helpful to just take the time just to talk about that for a second.
Yeah, it's true. The Oregon Forest Practices Act is one of the weakest on the Pacific Northwest. Now, just passed the legislature this week was the private forest accord, which increases buffers on streams by a bit. So it's got a bit improved just this year. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. One of the problems is that they used to have a harvest tax that the tax went to the county governments for a bunch of county services, and that was eliminated back in the early 90s. So a lot of these private lands are owned by out-of-state, corporate ownerships. And all that money goes out of state and very little comes back to the local government. So our Oregon Forest Practices Act definitely has a lot of problems.
Yeah. Except that it, and that those reforms need to happen. But as far as, I feel like it would be a huge stretch to get to the point where those forests could really be seen as protected. And it would have to, the intent behind any management would have to completely change, and that will take more than just reforming that one law. David, actually, I'm wondering from you, how, as more from the scientific realm, how would you want to see, your, studies that you contribute to inform policy? For example, you put together this great framework for climate reserves, but what is your deepest hope and dream as far as how that is used in policy?
Well, I think both of you are kind of hinting at the fact that we also do need a bit of a cultural shift in the forest management paradigm. I think it's notable how little of our forest is actually managed for what some people might say is the greatest good that they could provide. And so, yeah, the strategic forest frameworks paper was just a great thrill to work on. It made me think back to when I was actually an undergrad student, and if someone said, in the future you're going to get to work on a paper that prioritized where to protect forests across the United States for biodiversity, carbon, and water, I would have been incredibly excited to be a part of that. And I thought about that as we worked through that paper. And I think we really, as scientists, we certainly have to do our part now and follow through with opportunities like this to communicate to the public, and also to reach out to our policymakers consistently, and to educate them over the long term, over the coming years, to really educate them about what this data is about, what it's showing, and the opportunities we have to move forward quickly. I think it's important that we remember that the way you achieve great things in life is often just one step at a time, and it looks pretty insurmountable. My son and I were just looking at Ruby Peak yesterday, and looks pretty high this time of year, and there's a lot of snow up there, and we climbed it last summer, and we were patting ourselves on the back for getting up there. And it's one step at a time to climb a mountain. I would like us to see us take some big steps forward, and that's part of the reasons why I've been highlighting the roadless areas, and of course Oregon Wild has so much too, because if we could quickly take some powerful steps forward. And right now the reasons that we're losing a lot of those areas are mostly to fruitless activities. At the end of the day, we're getting very little out of it, and where the opportunity to protect them can contribute to some of humanity's most greatest problems. Truthfully, a lot of these areas are being hit with mechanized recreation practices as well, motorized recreation. That's a big deal, and that also degrades the intact quality for a lot of wildlife species and the habitat security. So there are a lot of reasons why we should move quickly and protect the areas where we can now. And let's get as close as we can to that 2030 by 30% by 2030 target. And I think when we do that, we'll be able to see the next steps with more clarity. So we kind of need to break the status quo, make some big steps forward. And I hope that this strategic forest reserves data will help us prioritize to do that. That is exactly what it's intended to do.
And we do have a little bit of time if you all, I see some questions that came in, if you all feel like addressing some of those.
I just want to say another word about the private lands. Can we get to where we need to get to without the private lands? I mean, there's so many of them in Oregon, private industrial forest lands. And another problem is that a lot of those private lands, they export their logs over to Asia or other countries. They don't come to our local mills, so we don't get jobs out of those private lands. A 209,000 acre Millicoma tree farm is logged heavily, and every log goes over to Asia. And so if we could somehow incentivize those logs to stay locally to our local mills, I don't know if that would help lengthen the rotation age and lengthen the carbon storage in those private lands. Something to think about.
Yeah, that's another thing we didn't really, don't have time to get into, and it wasn't really the topic, but it's true. I mean, those jobs aren't necessarily from sustainable practices or sustainable in general for our global environment. But what does a transition to a just and equitable economy look like while around our forests? And I'm actually not sure if there's a panel about that, but restoring the private forests, state forests, and our public lands that have been so degraded from years and years of resource extraction is a way of potentially getting there. That can help contribute to the protected ecosystems that we know we need and storing carbon, et cetera. But also put people to work, bringing salmon back and growing old forest structure. So yeah, kind of another paradigm shift that needs to happen, I think.
There's a question here about the Elliott legislation that just passed, where we, some of the Elliott, more than half of it is protected in a reserve now. And how, let me see, and what lessons we can learn from Save the Elliott movement to apply to other pressure points. The Elliott was great. What we did on the Elliott could be better. It's always could be better. We get what we can. And we hope that OSU is going to do climate research on the Elliott. Not in one of their written promises, but we hope for that. And so the other thing that happened was the private forest accord. So it's not just the Elliott. We also passed a private forest accord, which greatly increased the riparian buffers on private land. They went up to 100 feet. They went up from 20 feet to 100 feet. So that was a big win this year also. So that's all on private land. Like I said, we can influence public lands more than we can influence private lands because there are public lands. And so I think that's where we would get the biggest bang for the buck, is by putting the pressure on the public lands.
And honestly, where there's things still left to save, I mean, the restoration needs, are important, and growing back the forests that we've lost. But the public lands are where we still have biodiversity and stores of old trees with carbon that just simply don't exist outside of public lands, including state lands like the Elliott.
David, there's a question asking you to put up your first slide again.
Okay.
For our audience, sorry, while you do that, Dave, just throwing a FYI out there, if you all have anything that you want from our panelists, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try to see if we could make anything happen for you. And again, I just want to thank you all. It's so amazing when you get 3 experts who dedicate their career to conservation get together, and I think there was a lot of ideas that came out for future panelists that we'll definitely take into account, and we'll probably reach out again to expand this conversation hopefully to next year, and maybe, there's something new in a progressive way to talk about as well. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving our audience an outlet and giving them options on how they could actually get involved themselves.
Yeah, thanks. And I know there's a couple of comments and some other questions that we're getting in the Q&A, but a lot of them could be addressed by honestly taking a look at some of the other panels that are being offered by PILC this year or in previous years. So, and someone asked about whether these can be viewed later on YouTube, and I think the answer is yes on the PILC YouTube page. So you can, if you missed something because you're watching this or there's other conflicts in your day, you can go back and watch some other really great panels, including one about the Elliott. Yesterday, there was a great one that I watched this morning about collaborative groups and logging, and then one yesterday about forest carbon offsets and how the devil is in the details, someone mentioned in the Q&A. So lots of other places to learn.
Yeah, and I would just like to echo that, our YouTube channel is a great source. Please go on there and don't forget to subscribe and like the videos that you watch. And if there's no final words, again, thank you so much. This has been such a great panel. I personally learned so much, and I think our audience did too. So thanks again for your time, and please check out our brochure for the next and up and coming panels as well.
Thank you much.
Have a
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you all today.
Likewise, David, thank you for your time.
Yeah, take care.
Bye-bye.